The night Nellie Ralston rode into Dustfall, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1882, she had exactly 11 cents, a broken saddle strap, and a pride so fierce it could have stopped a stampede dead in its tracks. She came in from the east, which surprised people, because most of the hard cases came in from the south or the west, following the cattle trails or the old mining routes. But Nellie came from the east, from a place she never named to anyone, on a roan mare that looked about as tired as its rider. And when old Pete Calloway came out of the livery stable and offered to let her sleep in the hayloft for free, she looked at him with those storm-gray eyes and told him plainly that she did not accept charity. She would pay for the stall for the horse and she would see to herself. Pete told her there was a boarding house on the south side of Main Street run by a widow named Clara Hodge, and Nellie thanked him with the kind of stiff courtesy that suggested she had been raised somewhere with enough refinement to know what manners looked like, even if that place was now very far behind her. She did not go to Clara Hodge's boarding house. The town of Dustfall was not a large town. It sat in a broad valley between two ridges of red rock, and in the autumn of 1882 it held about 300 souls, a general store, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a small church of the Methodist persuasion, a jail, a telegraph office, and a schoolhouse that doubled as the meeting hall on Sundays when Reverend Dawes came through. There was also a land office, because this was still the time when the government was selling off parcels to homesteaders, and men came through regularly with their eyes full of dreams and their pockets full of paper money that the Wyoming Territory was happy to take. It was into this ordinary, functional, slightly dusty world that Nellie Ralston arrived, and the town was not entirely sure what to make of her. She was 24 years old, though she looked older around the eyes, and she was not beautiful in the way that the women in the illustrated magazines were beautiful. She was handsome, the way a well-made thing is handsome, with strong cheekbones and dark hair she kept pinned up under a battered hat, and hands that had clearly done real work. She was slim but not delicate, and she moved with the economy of someone who had learned that unnecessary motion was a luxury. For the first 3 days, nobody knew quite where she slept. She ate 1 meal a day at the Broken Spur, which served food at the long table in the back room for 12 cents a plate, and she nursed a cup of coffee for as long as anyone would let her, and she listened. She listened the way a person listens when they are gathering information, cataloging everything, making decisions behind those gray eyes that nobody else could see. On the 4th day, she went to the land office. The land agent was a man named Crutchfield, who wore a coat that had been fashionable in St. Louis about 10 years earlier, and who looked at Nellie with the particular brand of skepticism that men in official positions reserved for women who showed up alone with unclear purposes. He informed her that the minimum purchase for a homestead claim under the Homestead Act was 160 acres, and that the filing fee was $14, and that she would need to demonstrate intent to improve the land within a specified period. Nellie informed him that she was aware of the terms of the Homestead Act, that she had read it quite thoroughly, and that she was interested in the parcels along the northern creek, which she had already ridden out to inspect that morning. Crutchfield looked at her with the expression of a man whose morning has not gone the way he expected. She did not have $14, not yet, but she was working on it. She went to the general store, which was owned by a man named Abbott Greer and his wife Marianne, and she offered to work. Marianne, who was practical in the way that frontier women often were, told her she could stock shelves and keep accounts 3 days a week for 25 cents a day in meals. Nellie accepted. She would not, however, accept the cot in the back room that Marianne offered, which confused Marianne considerably, because the nights in October in Wyoming were not nothing, and sleeping rough in the autumn was not a romantic adventure but a genuine hardship. But Nellie had her reasons, and she kept them to herself, and she slept where she slept, and in the morning she appeared at the store with her boots clean and her hair pinned and her eyes sharp, and whatever private suffering she was enduring, she was not going to let anyone see it. This was when Henry Haskins first noticed her. Henry Haskins was 31 years old, and he had owned the small ranch north of Dustfall for 4 years. It was not a grand spread. 40 acres with water rights to the northern creek, a solid barn, a house he had built himself over 2 summers, and about 60 head of cattle that were somewhere between respectable and struggling, depending on which way the beef prices moved. He was a tall man, not in an imposing way but in the way of someone who had grown tall without thinking about it, with brown hair that wanted to curl at the edges and a jaw that was always either freshly shaved or 3 days past it, never anything in between. He had quiet brown eyes and a habit of listening before he spoke, which people sometimes mistook for slowness, and which was actually something quite different. He came into Greer's store on a Thursday morning for flour, coffee, and lamp oil, and he found Nellie reorganizing the bulk goods on the left wall with the methodical efficiency of someone who has strong opinions about organizational systems. He watched her for a moment before he said anything. "That top shelf has been wrong since Abbott put it up in '78, he said. She did not startle, which told him she had heard him come in. She looked down at him from where she was standing on the step stool. "The whole arrangement is wrong," she said. "He has the heavier bolts on top, which means every time someone reaches for them there is a risk of them coming down. I moved them to the lower shelf. Abbott is going to have thoughts about that. I expect so." She went back to what she was doing, and Henry went to find Marianne to ask for his flour, and that was that, except that it was not that, because on his way out he found himself pausing at the door and looking back at her, and there was something about the set of her shoulders, something about the precision of what she was doing, that stayed with him for the rest of the day. He asked Marianne about her before he left. Marianne told him what she knew, which was not much. Nellie Ralston, Eastern woman, riding through, interested in land, would not accept a place to sleep, which was worrying Marianne considerably because the nights were getting colder. "She sleep in the livery?" Henry asked. "Pete says no. She paid for the horse's stall and that's all." Henry turned his hat in his hands. "She's sleeping rough." "I cannot prove it," Marianne said, "but I believe so." He thought about that on the ride home. He thought about it while he fed the cattle and checked the fence line on the north pasture, and cooked himself a supper of salt pork and cornbread. He sat on his porch in the cold dark afterward, and thought about the kind of pride that would make a person sleep on the ground in the Wyoming autumn rather than accept help. And he did not judge it, because he understood it in a way that he could not quite articulate. He had come west himself 10 years ago with almost nothing, after his father's farm in Ohio had gone under in the panic of 1873, and there had been nothing left to inherit but debt and disappointment. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas, had worked mining camps in Colorado, had done 100 things that were hard and cold and underpaid, and he had never once asked anyone for help he could not repay, and he had never once accepted charity, and he understood the particular mathematics of a pride like that. It was not arrogance. It was something more fundamental, something about staying whole in a world that would very much like to break you down into parts it found more convenient. He understood Nellie Ralston before he knew a single fact about her, and that understanding was the beginning of something, though he did not know it yet. The following week he came into the store again, on a day she was working, and this time he stayed long enough for a proper conversation. He bought what he needed, and then he sat at the small counter where Marianne kept the coffee going, and he drank a cup, and Nellie came to refill it without being asked, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and then he asked her about the land she'd ridden out to look at. Her face changed when he asked about that. Not much, but enough. A kind of animation came into it, something that had been carefully kept back, and she sat down on the stool on the other side of the counter and told him about the North Creek parcels with a detail and a practicality that told him she had been thinking about nothing else. "The water's good year-round," she said. "I checked the flow in 3 different spots, and there's a natural windbreak on the north side, a line of cottonwoods that somebody planted a long time ago. The soil is workable. I have read about winter wheat, and I think," she stopped herself. She pressed her lips together. "What?" he said. "I think it can be done," she said more carefully. "I think it is possible." "It is," he said, and he meant it, because he had looked at that land too when he first came to the valley before he settled on the piece he bought. "It is good land. Who told you about it?" "Nobody told me. I looked at the survey maps at the land office." He found that he was smiling. "You read survey maps?" "My father was a surveyor," she said. "Before." She stopped again. Before was apparently a door she was not ready to open all the way. He did not push on it. He drank his coffee and talked about the land, about the creek, about what she'd need for a first winter if she managed to file the claim. And she listened with the same focused attention he'd seen her use on the Bolt goods, cataloging everything, making notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. When he left, he tipped his hat at the door, and she nodded once, and he rode home with the peculiar sensation of a man who has encountered something that has shifted the alignment of his interior world without his permission. Over the following 3 weeks, a pattern established itself that neither of them fully acknowledged. Henry came to the store twice a week now instead of once, and he always seemed to arrive on the days when Nellie was working, and they talked. They talked about land and cattle, and the price of grain, and the winter that was coming, and the state of the territorial government, and 100 other practical things. But underneath all those practical things there was something else happening, something that moved the way groundwater moves, deep and quiet and absolutely determined. Nellie's savings grew. She had $16 now. She told him one afternoon, which meant the filing fee was covered, and she had $2 left over, which was not enough. $2 doesn't take you through winter, Henry said. He was careful about how he said it, not in the way of a man pointing out failure, but in the way of a man who is working through a problem alongside someone. "I know," she said, "but I'm working on it. Abbott would give you more hours." "I know that too. I'm going to ask him next week." He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There's work at my place," he said, and then stopped, because he was conscious of how that could sound, and he did not want it to sound wrong. "I don't mean anything improper by that. I need someone to keep accounts. I have about 60 head, and I am not natural with figures, and every autumn I spend 3 weeks trying to sort out what I owe and what is owed to me, and I always come out the other side of it feeling like I've been thrown by a horse." She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze. "I would pay you," he said. "Same rate as Abbott, 25 cents a day. It would be half a day's work most days, maybe a full day around the end of the month." She thought about it. He could see her thinking about it, turning it over, checking it for problems. "The books are here," she said finally. "You would bring them to the store." "I would bring them to the store," he said. Something in her settled. "All right," she said. So Henry brought her his account books, which were in a state that made her wince visibly, but which she took on without comment, and she sorted them out over the course of 4 afternoons, and at the end of it she presented him with a clear ledger, everything categorized and balanced, and a brief written summary of where his financial picture stood, which was better than he'd feared and complicated in some ways he hadn't anticipated. He paid her honestly and thanked her sincerely, and she accepted both with the same measured courtesy she applied to everything. And he went home that evening and sat on his porch in the dark and thought about the way she had looked while she was working on the ledger, bent over the counter with a stub of pencil in her hand and her lips pressed together and everything else in the world entirely irrelevant to her. And he thought about how, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be, he was in considerable danger. But Nellie Ralston had made very clear by everything she did, and didn't do, that she was not in Dustfall to be rescued or romanced or any other thing that a man might have in mind. She was there to build something that was her own, on land that would be hers, with money she had earned herself. And Henry Haskins respected that so completely and so utterly that it was its own form of love, even if neither of them would have used that word for it yet. The last days of October arrived, and the temperature began to drop seriously. Wyoming autumn was not the gentle amber drift of Ohio or Virginia autumn. It came down off the mountains like a verdict, hard and deliberate, and the people of Dustfall moved into their cold weather routines with the efficiency of long practice. Nellie was still sleeping outside. Henry knew this. He knew it the way you know something that you have been told obliquely from multiple sources, by the dark circles under her eyes some mornings, by the way she stood very close to the stove in the store's back room when she thought no one was looking, by the thin blanket he'd seen rolled behind her saddle one evening when he was leaving the store. He knew it, and he did not say anything, because he understood that to say anything was to become another person who wanted to diminish her, another voice telling her she could not manage, and he would not be that. But the nights were getting very cold now, and he began to lie awake in his own warm house worrying about her in a way that was quiet and persistent, and that did not resolve itself into anything he could comfortably act on. He talked to Marianne about it one morning, carefully. Marianne had already tried twice to give Nellie the back room cot, and Nellie had declined twice with the same polite firmness she applied to everything. "She won't take it as charity," Marianne said. "She's very clear about that." "What if it wasn't charity?" Henry said. "What do you mean?" He thought about it. "She's doing accounts now for me. What if you framed it differently? What if the room was part of the payment for her work here, not a gift, a part of the arrangement?" Marianne looked at him shrewdly. "That's smart. I don't know if it'll work." "I'll try," Marianne said. "It's got a better chance than just asking." But Nellie turned that down too, with a thank you that was genuine and an explanation that was brief. She said that her work at the store was her work at the store, and the rate was fair, and she did not want to complicate things by mixing in other arrangements, and she appreciated the offer very much. Marianne reported this back to Henry, and Henry nodded and said nothing further. He drove home under a sky that had gone from blue to the particular iron gray that meant serious cold was coming within a day or two. And he thought about Nellie Ralston out in that cold. And he thought about what he could do that would not be something she would refuse. And he thought about it so hard and so long that he nearly drove his wagon into the fence post at the edge of his property. He sat outside that evening for a long time after supper. The temperature had dropped sharply with the sunset, and his breath made clouds in the air, and he could see the stars very clearly, which meant the insulating cloud cover was gone and the night would be brutal. He thought about the small hollow in the cottonwoods along the creek, about a mile and a half south of his property, where he had seen signs before of someone having spent the night. A fire ring, some disturbed grass. He thought about Nellie's mare, who needed to be somewhere warm. He went inside and he thought some more, and then he made a decision that was so simple it surprised him. He propped his front door open. He laid extra wood on the fire, banked it carefully so it would hold through the night, and he set out an extra blanket on the chair near the hearth, and he put the kettle where it could be brought to boil quickly, and he set out a tin of coffee and a cup, and then he went to bed and left the door open, and he did not say a word to anyone about it, and he did not leave a note, and he did not wait at the window, and he told himself that she might not come and that was all right. He was only leaving a door open. That was a thing a man could do with no expectation and no explanation. The night was the coldest of the autumn so far. Nellie had made her shelter in the cottonwoods, as he had guessed. She had made it quite cleverly, with a lean-to of pine boughs she'd cut and a fire that was small and efficient, and she had managed well enough through October. But this night was different. This night the cold came with a wind that found every gap in the pine boughs and every thin place in her blanket, and the fire would not hold the way fires need to hold when the temperature drops past a certain point, and by midnight she was shaking in a way that was concerning even to herself. She lay there in the dark and shook and thought about her reasons. Her reasons were these. She had grown up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a surveyor named James Ralston and his wife Margaret, and she had been raised in a household of modest comfort and considerable dignity. Her father had died when she was 19, of a fever that came on fast and killed him in 8 days, and afterward her mother had made a practical arrangement with a man named Gerald Holt, who had money and a house and a way of looking at Nellie that she did not like. She had left at 20. She had gone to her father's sister in Cincinnati, and her aunt's husband had been kind for about 6 months, and then had begun to suggest that perhaps Nellie could make herself more useful around the house in ways that she had no intention of making herself useful. She had left Cincinnati at 21. She had worked her way west, doing laundry and cooking and keeping accounts wherever she could, saving carefully, and she had learned along the way that every time she accepted help from someone, there was a cost attached to it that she was not told about up front. The world seemed to believe that a woman alone was either property to be claimed or a problem to be solved, and every offer of shelter she had ever received had come wrapped in that belief, visible or hidden, conscious or not. She did not think this about everyone. She was not a fool. She knew that some people were simply kind. But the cost of being wrong was too high, and so she had built herself a wall of self-sufficiency that was also a way of staying safe, and she had maintained it through cold and hunger and loneliness, and all the other things that the world uses to erode your determination. But tonight the cold was not a metaphor. It was a physical fact, and it was doing things to her hands and feet that were not right, and she was shaking hard enough that her teeth were clicking together, and she lay there in the dark and the wind, and she thought about the way Henry Haskins had looked at her in the store, and she thought about what she knew about him. She had learned quite a bit, in the way you learn things in a small town, which is by listening. She had learned that he had come west on nothing and built what he had by himself. She had learned that he was quiet and fair, and that Pete Calloway, who was crotchety about everyone, said Henry was a good man. She had learned that he paid his bills on time and did not drink heavily, and had never been in trouble with the law and treated his cattle with a care that spoke well of a person's character. She had learned that he had been sweet on the schoolteacher 3 years ago, but that nothing had come of it, and that he had not been sweet on anyone since. She had learned all of this in the way she learned everything, carefully and without revealing that she was learning it, and she had filed it away in that interior catalog and tried not to think about what she was doing with it. She was shaking so hard now that she could not make herself stop. She got up. She rolled her blanket with numb fingers and tied it behind her saddle, and she saddled the mare, whose sides were shaking with cold too, and she stood in the dark in the cottonwoods, and she made herself think clearly. She would not go to town. The boarding house was not an option. She would not knock on Marianne Greer's back door at midnight. She would not go to Pete Calloway's hayloft. She would not. She thought about Henry. She thought about his house, which she had never been inside but which she had seen from the road, a solid square of a building with good chinking, and a window that glowed warm in the evenings when she'd ridden past on her way back to the Cottonwood Hollow. She thought about the ledger she'd balanced for him and the way he'd looked at it, not with the condescension of a man who is humoring a woman, but with the genuine attention of someone who finds the work valuable. She thought about the way he always arrived on the days she worked. She thought about the particular way he did not press, did not push, did not suggest that she needed anything, just talked to her as though she were simply a person, doing the things a person does, and let the talking be what it was. Her hands were numb now. She rode north. She came to his property and she rode along the fence line to the gate, and she stopped there in the dark and she sat on the mare and she looked at the house. There was a glow from the window. That surprised her because it was past midnight and she had not expected that. She rode a little closer and she saw that the front door was open, not just unlocked, open, wide. The firelight from inside made a warm rectangle on the dark porch, and there was no one visible, no figure in the doorway, no one waiting. Just an open door. She sat there on the mare for a long time, long enough to get colder, long enough for the mare to stamp and shake her head. There was no note. There was no invitation. There was no offer. There was just a door that was open and a fire inside that was clearly burning for the benefit of whoever might need it, and nobody waiting to see if she would take it, nobody to watch her decide, nobody to make her feel like a charity case or a problem or a transaction. She dismounted. She led the mare to the small barn, and she was startled to find that it too was open, and that the lantern inside was turned down low but burning, and that there was a stall prepared with fresh hay and water and a measure of grain in the bucket. For a second horse that was not his. She stood there with the mare, and she breathed very carefully, and she did not let herself cry, because she was not going to cry, but it was a near thing. She settled the mare in the stall and covered her with the extra blanket she found hanging on the stall door, and she walked back to the house, and she stepped through the open door. The warmth hit her like a wave. She had not known how cold she was until she was not cold anymore, and her hands started to shake with a different kind of shaking, the kind that is your body reclaiming itself. She stood just inside the door and looked around. The room was clean and simple, a table and 2 chairs and a fireplace that was doing its job with serious commitment. The kettle was set up on the hook. There was coffee on the table. There was a blanket on the chair nearest the fire, a heavy wool blanket folded. There was no note, no explanation, no name signed anywhere. Just all of this arranged and left, and whoever had arranged it had gone to bed and left her to it completely. She closed the door behind her. She got out of her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. She made the coffee, because the kettle was already just at the edge of hot, and she sat down in the chair by the fire, and she pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and she drank the coffee and let the warmth work through her, and she sat there for a long time in the quiet and the light and thought about what kind of man leaves a door open without a word. She slept in the chair by the fire. She did not go looking for a bed, because that was not the offer. The offer was a door left open, a fire burning, coffee on the table, and she took that and no more, and it was enough, and she slept like someone who has finally put down something very heavy. In the morning she was up before light. She rekindled the fire, which had burned down but not out, and she swept the floor with the broom she found by the door, and she tidied what little needed tidying, and she made fresh coffee and left a cup of it hot and ready, and she was out the door and gone before the sun came up. And the door she left closed but not latched, in case he wanted the morning air. Henry came down the stairs at first light and found the swept floor and the hot coffee and the door closed, and he stood in the middle of his room and felt something move through him that he did not have a precise name for. Something that felt like relief, and something that felt like hope, and something that felt like a very particular kind of sorrow at the thought of how cold she must have been to have crossed that threshold, and how much it must have cost her, and how careful she had been about it, taking only what had been offered, leaving the place better than she'd found it. He went to the store that afternoon, and she was there, and she looked at him across the counter, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything about the previous night, not a word. And he bought his coffee and his flour, and he sat for a cup, and they talked about the land office, because she had made an appointment with Crutchfield for the following Monday, and she had enough for the filing fee now. "Are you comfortable with the paperwork?" he asked. "The claim forms can be a puzzle." "I have read them," she said. "I filled out one 4 years ago," he said. "I still have a copy if you wanted to look at it." She looked at him steadily. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you." They were both quiet for a moment. "It was cold last night," he said, finally, not looking at her directly, looking at his coffee cup. "Yes," she said, "it was very cold." "I expect it will be cold again tonight," he said, "getting into November now." "It is," she said. "The latch on my door has been sticking," he said. "I've been meaning to fix it, probably ought to just leave it for now." She was quiet for a moment, and then he heard something in her voice that might have been the closest thing to warmth she had let him hear. "That's probably wise," she said. "No sense fighting a stubborn latch." He looked up, and she was looking at him, and for just a moment something passed between them that was not quite a smile from either side but was adjacent to one, something mutual and careful and very clear. The pattern continued. The door was open on the cold nights and closed on the nights that were bearable, and Nellie came when she needed to come and did not when she could manage, and every morning the floor was swept and the coffee was fresh, and neither of them spoke about it directly. But the conversations at the store grew longer, and the silences between them became comfortable rather than careful, and Henry began to notice small things. The particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she went very still when something pleased her, the way her hands moved when she was describing something she cared about. She talked about the land she was going to file on. She talked about it the way some people talk about a person they love, with a possessive tenderness that was almost painful to witness. She described what she would plant and where. She described the house she intended to build, which was modest and practical and also, in the details she chose, quietly beautiful. She wanted a south-facing window in the main room. She wanted to plant rose bushes along the east wall because her mother had had rose bushes. She talked about what kind of soil the creekside parcel had and what it would take to bring it to productivity. And she talked about the winter wheat she'd read about in a pamphlet the land office had. And her face, when she talked about these things, was a different face than the one she showed the rest of the world. It was open and certain, and full of a longing that she was not afraid to show when the subject was land, because land was not something that could take advantage of a longing. Henry listened. He always listened, and he asked questions that showed he had understood what she said, and he offered information from his own experience without making it advice she had not asked for, and she received it the same way she received everything from him, carefully, with respect. On the Monday of her appointment with Crutchfield, Henry drove his wagon to town instead of riding, as though he had things to fetch, which he did, and he parked in front of Greer's store and he unloaded his things, and then he walked, casually, past the land office. Through the window he could see Nellie sitting across from Crutchfield, very upright, with her small account book open on the table, and he saw the moment Crutchfield said something that stiffened her spine, and he thought for a moment about going in and then decided against it, because she would not want that. Instead, he stood in front of the land office window and made himself look busy with his wagon, and after about 20 minutes she came out. She had filed. He could tell by the way she walked. There was something in her that had released slightly, some held breath she'd been holding since Pennsylvania or Cincinnati or wherever her beginning was, and she came down the steps and she nearly walked into him, and she stopped and looked at him. "I filed," she said. "I can see that," he said. She pressed her lips together and looked away down the street and then back at him. "He gave me some trouble," she said, "about being a woman filing alone. He said I needed a male relative or a husband to co-sign." Henry felt something tighten in him. It's not what the law says," she said firmly. "I told him that. I quoted him the specific section. He was not pleased about it, but he could not argue with it." She looked at the land office door. "He also tried to tell me the North Creek parcels were not available, but I had checked the register myself last week and they were, and I told him so." Henry looked at her. "You came prepared." "I always come prepared," she said. He found himself smiling, and she caught the smile and something shifted in her face, a softening around the edges that she let happen for a moment before she composed herself again. "I'm going to look at it properly this afternoon," she said. "Ride out and walk it, now that it's mine." "Do you want company?" he said. He asked it simply, without pressure, just a question, and she considered it. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." They rode out north together in the afternoon, leaving his wagon at the store and taking both horses, and the land looked different in the flat gold light of the November afternoon than it had looked in the summer surveys she'd been reading. The cottonwoods were bare now, just the elegant structure of them, and the creek moved quietly between its banks, and the grass was flattened and frost-pale and beautiful in the way that things pared down to essentials are beautiful. She dismounted at the creek, and she walked the bank and he walked beside her, and she pointed out everything she had been seeing in her mind for weeks. Here the first garden plot. Here the south-facing slope for winter wheat. Here the windbreak the cottonwoods made against the north wind. Here the rise where the house would go because it was above the flood line and would catch the morning light. He listened to all of it, and he looked at the places she pointed to, and he saw it too, saw what she was seeing, the potential of it, the future she was building in the air above this flat, cold ground. And it was so entirely real and so entirely hers that he felt something shift in him, something that had been holding carefully still for weeks. And he thought, quietly and with great certainty, that he was in love with Nellie Ralston. He did not say so. He was not foolish enough to say so. But he thought it clearly, standing on the frozen bank of the North Creek in November, watching her describe a house that didn't exist yet with the conviction of someone who can already smell the wood smoke from it. And it settled into him like a river finding its bed. They rode back in the late afternoon, and the sky went orange and then pink and then the deep cold blue of evening. And they rode mostly in silence, which was a comfortable silence, and she rode with a looseness in her shoulders he had not seen before, a kind of ease. And when they reached the road that divided his property from the open range, she reined up and looked at him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It was good to have someone to talk to." "Any time," he said, and then carefully, "You know where my door is." The words were the same as always, casual, without weight, and she received them the same way, a nod, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was close. They said good night, and she rode south, and he watched her go and then went inside. November deepened. The temperature dropped past the uncomfortable into the serious, and the first real snow came in the second week of the month, 2 inches that fell overnight and turned the valley into something quiet and white and new-looking. Nellie came to Henry's house on the worst nights and not on the others, and on the nights she came she always left it better than she found it. And on the mornings he came downstairs, he always found that hot coffee and a swept floor, and an absence that felt inhabited. He began to save things for her. Small things, practical things, that he could give her in a way that was not charity but was something else. He had a second pair of wool gloves that he'd never used, and one morning at the store he handed them over and said they'd been a gift from his cousin and didn't fit him. Did she want them? She looked at him for a long moment and then took them and said thank you, and he watched her put them on right there at the counter and flex her fingers in them and look down at her hands, and something in her face was very young for just a moment, very young and very tired, and something else that he couldn't name. She gave him something in return the following week. She had been doing accounts at the store, and she'd noticed an error in the records that had cost Abbott money for 3 months. And she'd found it and fixed it, and Abbott had given her a small bonus, and she used part of it to buy Henry a new ledger book, because his old one was falling apart, and she brought it to him at the store wrapped in paper, and said she'd noticed his was in poor condition when she'd been working in it, and he ought to have a new one. He held the wrapped book in both hands and looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He thought about that for the rest of the day. In December the snow came in earnest. Wyoming winter arrived with the particular brutality of high plains winters, and the people of Dustfall dug in, stocked up, and prepared for the long siege. Henry rode into town less often but came when he could, and on the days the snow was too heavy he sat in his house and did what needed doing and thought about Nellie. He worried about her land. She had filed the claim, but she had not yet built on it, which was necessary under the terms of the Homestead Act to prove intent. Without a structure on the land, she could lose the claim. He knew she knew this. He also knew that she could not build in winter, and that she was aware of the time pressure, and that worrying about it for her was not his job, but he could not quite stop. She came to him with this on a December afternoon, riding up to his door in the snow with her face red from the cold and her breath coming in white clouds, and she knocked properly this time, not using the open door but knocking, and he let her in and got her to the fire, and she sat down and said, without preamble, that she needed to think out loud. He sat across from her and gave her his complete attention. "The act requires a structure within 6 months of filing," she said. "I filed in November. By May I need something on that land. I have been running the figures, and I believe I can afford the lumber and the labor if I keep working through winter, but I need to know the right people to hire, and I need to know what I can do myself." "What can you do yourself?" he said. "Honestly." "I have done basic carpentry," she said, My father taught me. I can lay a foundation, I can frame, I can chink, I cannot do a roof alone. You don't need to do it alone, he said. Not the whole thing. She looked at him. It's common practice, he said carefully. Neighbors help each other build. It's not charity. Everyone does it. When I built my barn, the people from 2 properties over helped me raise the frame, and I helped them harvest the following summer. That's how it's done out here. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through it. A fair exchange, she said. Always, he said. She nodded slowly. I could do that, she said, if it's a fair exchange. It will be, he said. I'll ask around. Pete Calloway's boy is a good carpenter. Abbott has cousins who did building work in Cheyenne. He was volunteering himself too, without saying so, and she might have known that and said nothing about it, or she might have understood it later. But she nodded and said she appreciated the information, and she rode back to town before the afternoon light failed. He sat in his house alone that evening and thought that of all the things in his life, this woman and her fierce and careful and extraordinary refusal to be diminished was the most remarkable thing he had encountered, and he would very much like to know what it would feel like to love her and be loved back, and he had no idea when or whether she would let him anywhere near that possibility. But he was content to wait because the waiting itself had become something he valued. Christmas came. Dustfall did the things small towns do at Christmas. The church service with Reverend Dawes, who had come through for the occasion, and the community dinner at the schoolhouse, and the small domestic rituals of people who have made a life in a hard place and find joy in it with determined practicality. Marianne Greer organized the dinner and everyone brought something, and the schoolhouse was warm and crowded and smelled of pine boughs and roasted meat. Henry brought venison from a deer he'd taken in late November, butchered and prepared properly. Nellie brought a pie. Apple with a crust that was, by common agreement, remarkable, and this produced a moment of surprise among the townspeople who had been watching her carefully and had somewhat assumed, based on her general demeanor, that she would not be a person who baked pies. She handed it to Marianne without comment, and Marianne cut it, and it disappeared in approximately 7 minutes. Henry found a seat beside her at the long table and they ate together and talked quietly while the room was loud around them. And it was the most settled he had felt in years, and he believed, looking at her in the warm light of the schoolhouse, with her hair slightly looser than usual and a color in her cheeks from the warmth, that she felt something like it too, though she would not have named it. After supper, Reverend Dawes led the carols and Henry sang, badly, which made Nellie look at him with raised eyebrows, and he said, quite honestly, that he had never been able to carry a tune and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, and she said that was very sensible. And then he heard her sing one line of the next carol, and she had a voice that was low and clear and true, and he said so, and she looked as though she had been caught at something private, but she did not stop singing. They walked out together when the evening wound down and the night was clear and ferociously cold, and the stars were brilliant overhead in that way they are in high places in winter, and she stopped on the porch of the schoolhouse and looked up at them. My father used to name them, she said. The constellations. He said a surveyor needs to know the sky as well as the ground. He stood beside her and looked up. Which ones do you know? She named them. Orion was clear and vivid to the southwest, and she traced the shape of it in the air with one gloved hand, and she named the stars within it, Beetle, Juice, and Rigel, and she told him about the mythology of it in a way that was matter of fact, but underneath which he could hear something tender, the memory of a father who had taught her these things, a father who was gone. He stood very close to her, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of her even in the cold. He sounds like he was a good man, Henry said. He was, she said. He was the best man I ever knew. She paused. Until recently, she said very quietly in a voice that was careful and low and clearly cost her something to say. He stood very still. She was looking at the stars, not at him, and her jaw was set the way it got when she had decided to do something and was seeing it through. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, equally quietly and carefully, I am glad to hear that, Nellie. It was the first time he had used her first name without the formality of Miss Ralston, and she turned and looked at him. And in the starlight her face was very clear and very open, and very frightening in the way that openness is frightening when you have kept yourself closed for a long time. "Henry," she said, "just his name, just that." "Yes," he said. The cold was very cold around them. Their breath made clouds in the dark. She was looking at him with those storm-gray eyes, and he was looking at her. And the distance between them was not very great. And then she took one half-step forward, and he put out his hand, and she took it. And they stood there in the Wyoming winter cold on the porch of the Dustfall schoolhouse holding hands. And it was possibly the most significant thing that had happened in either of their lives. And neither of them moved for a long while. He walked her to where the mare was hitched. He helped her mount, which was unnecessary because she could mount perfectly well without help, but she accepted it as what it was, which was not a suggestion that she needed help but an expression of something else, and she looked down at him from the saddle and he looked up at her. "The latch on my door is still sticking," he said. She held his gaze. "I'll be riding past," she said, "if the light is on." She rode south and he watched her until the dark took her, and he went home and kept the fire burning and the door unlatched and the kettle ready, and she came. And the next morning he was up early for the first time and he made breakfast properly, with eggs he had kept wrapped in the cold and a piece of salt pork and cornbread. And when she came downstairs, she stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at the table set for two and looked at him. "I hope that's acceptable," he said. She sat down at the table. "It's acceptable," she said. They ate breakfast together in the quiet of the morning, and outside the snow was falling softly again, and the house was warm, and there was nothing in the world outside that needed attending to for at least another hour, and they sat at the table and talked about things that had nothing to do with land or accounts or practical matters. They talked about Ohio and Pennsylvania, and the people they had been before they came to this valley, and it was careful and slow and real. January was brutal. February was worse. But Nellie came often now, and they had dropped the pretense that it was about the cold, even if the cold was still genuine. She came because she wanted to, and because there was food on the table and a fire and a man who talked to her as though she were the most sensible person in the room, which she usually was, and she stayed until nearly dawn and rode back to her arrangement in town before the world was awake. One evening in February she came to the door and he opened it before she could knock, and she looked at him and he looked at her and he said, "Nellie, I need to tell you something." "All right," she said, stepping inside. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it plainly without decoration because he was not a man who decorated things. "I have been for some time. I don't expect anything from you on account of it, and I am not going to change how I behave toward you regardless of what you say. I just think you ought to know because I am tired of not saying it." She took her coat off and hung it on the peg, and she turned around and looked at him, and her face was doing all the things her face did when she was making a decision, the still quality of it, the slightly compressed mouth. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." He waited. "I am afraid," she said, and the word afraid in her voice was like hearing a stone wall say the word, monumental and reluctant and entirely honest. "I am afraid because I have learned that accepting things from people costs more than the things are worth, and I do not know what loving you would cost me." "I know," he said. "I have watched you be afraid of it for months, and I have tried not to make it worse." "You haven't," she said. "You have been the most careful person I have ever encountered." She looked at him steadily. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to, and I cannot manage it." He crossed the room and he took her face in his hands and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same focused intensity she brought to everything she did, and the fire was burning behind them and the snow was falling outside, and neither of them said anything for a while after that. When they sat down by the fire she said, "I need to understand something. I need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I am going to build my house," she said. "I am going to work my land. I am not going to give those things up for any reason, and I am not going to become a person who asks permission for the things she does with her own property." "I know that," he said. "I've always known that. Those things are part of what I love." She looked at him for a long time. "You are a very unusual man, Henry Haskins." "I have been told I am quiet," he said. "You are very loud," she said. "You just don't use words for it." He smiled at that, and she looked at his smile, and something in her face did what it had been doing for months in secret, which was soften completely. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in Wyoming, and the valley turned green in an urgent and emphatic way, and the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and Nellie's land was there waiting for her. The building community that Henry had organized came together in April. Pete Calloway's boy James, who was 22 and a skilled carpenter, and two of Abbott's Cheyenne cousins who had come for the winter and stayed, and Henry himself, and they spent 3 weekends in April and May raising the frame and laying the roof of a small, solid house on the rise above the North Creek, exactly where she had told him it would go, with the south-facing window in the main room and the east wall where the rose bushes would go. Nellie worked alongside them every day. She was not a spectator in the building of her own house. She swung a hammer with the efficiency her father had taught her, and she knew how to read a frame, and she had drawn up the plans herself over the winter in the margins of her account book. And James Calloway told Henry privately that she was the most prepared person he'd ever done a build for, which Henry received without surprise. The house went up. She stood in front of it on the evening the last of the main work was done, standing in the long gold light of a May evening, and he stood beside her and looked at it with her. "It's real," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "It's real," he said. She was quiet for a long time. He did not say anything. "I didn't let myself believe it for a while," she said. "That it would actually happen, that I would actually get here." She turned and looked at him. "You helped make it real." "You made it real," he said. "I just kept the coffee hot." She looked at him steadily. "Henry, yes. I want to marry you," she said. "But I want to keep this land in my name, and I want us to be clear that this land is mine. Is that something you can accept?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said immediately. "Nellie, yes. This land is yours. It will always be yours. And you're not saying that because you feel you ought to. I need you to mean it." "I mean it exactly as I say it," he said. "Your land is yours." "I have my land. Ours is something else, a third thing." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Ask me properly then." He did not have a ring. He had not planned for this conversation this evening, and he did not have a ring, and he thought very briefly about that and then decided it was not the most important thing. He turned to face her and he took her hands and he said, "Nellie Ralston, will you marry me?" She looked at him with those gray eyes in the evening light. "Yes," she said. "Henry Haskins, I will." He kissed her in front of her new house in the May evening, and the creek ran behind them and the cottonwoods rustled above, and the sky was enormous and going pink, and it was possibly the most perfect moment either of them had experienced, and they both knew it. They were married in June of 1883 in the Methodist Church in Dustfall, with Reverend Dawes officiating and Marianne Greer weeping happily in the second pew, and Pete Calloway in the third looking gruff but pleased. Nellie wore a dress that Marianne had helped her sew from good blue fabric bought at the store, not white. She had not wanted white. She had wanted the blue because it was practical and it suited her. And Henry wore his good suit that he had bought in Denver in 1879, and which still fit him well enough. She walked into the church alone because she had no one to walk with her, no father, no family, and she did it without hesitation, her back straight and her head up, and Henry watched her walk toward him and thought he had never seen anything more formidable and more beautiful in his life. After the ceremony, the town had a celebration at the schoolhouse, because that was the Dustfall way, and there was dancing, and Henry discovered that Nellie could dance, which she had not previously disclosed, and she was good at it, moving with the same precision and economy she brought to everything. And they danced until the candles were burning down and the older folks had gone home, and only the young ones remained. They went home together, to her house on the North Creek rise, because she had asked him if they could start there, and he had said of course. And they lay in the dark in the house she had built, and he told her things he had not told anyone, about Ohio and the farm and his father, and the years of working on nothing towards something. And she told him things too, about Pennsylvania and her father and Cincinnati and the long road west. And they talked until they fell asleep, and the creek ran outside and the cottonwoods breathed in the June dark. The summer was full and busy. They worked their respective lands and helped each other when it was useful and stayed out of each other's business when it was not. And the practicality of two self-sufficient people building a life together was also a kind of romance, a daily choice, a repeated returning to each other that was more solid than anything grand or gestured. He would find her at the creek in the mornings running the water gauge she'd rigged up to measure flow, and she would find him at the fence line in the late afternoon checking for winter damage. And they would ride home together in the evenings and cook supper together, and sit on the porch of whichever house they were at, and the valley was wide and quiet around them. She planted winter wheat in September on the south-facing slope she'd identified, and she planted it with the meticulous attention to the pamphlet's instructions and to her own observations of the soil and the light. Henry watched her do it and helped when she asked him to, carrying and turning and tamping, and she was focused and entirely in her own world during the planting, and he stayed in the edges of that world, and it was fine. It was more than fine. The wheat came in the following summer, not abundantly, because it was the first year and the soil was still becoming what it needed to be, but enough. Enough to show that the land could do what she'd said it could do, enough to make Crutchfield at the land office concede, when he saw the figures, that the claim was well-founded. She stood in the field and ran the wheat heads through her fingers, and she closed her eyes, and Henry, watching from the edge of the field, turned away because the moment felt private, too private for even him to witness. He planted rose bushes on the east wall of her house in the spring. He had sent away for them by mail to a nursery in St. Louis, because that was how such things were obtained in 1883 Wyoming, and they arrived in careful packaging, and he planted them while she was at the store. And when she came home, she found them there against the wall, 6 bushes, dormant but established, and she came to find him in the barn where he was working on the tack. She stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at him. "The roses," she said. "I hope I got the right kind," he said. "I ordered the red ones because you said your mother had red ones." She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she walked to him and she put her arms around him with the straightforward completeness of a person who has decided to give something and is not going to do it by halves, and he held her, and she said into his shoulder, "You remember everything I say." "I do," he said. "That's a remarkable thing," she said. "No," he said. "You're the remarkable thing, I just pay attention." By the autumn of 1884, Nellie knew she was expecting. She told Henry one evening at the table over supper, simply and directly in the way she did everything, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. It went so completely open that it was almost unguarded, and then he got up from the table and came around and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands and said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I have been checking the symptoms against Dr. Graham's medical guide, and everything is consistent and normal." He looked at her with such an expression of mingled tenderness and absolute helpless love that she laughed, which was something she did more often now, a sound that surprised her every time it came out of her. "Henry," she said, "I am well, I am happy. I am going to need you to perhaps not make that face every time you look at me for the next several months, or I will not be responsible for my responses." "What face?" he said. "The face you're making right now." He composed himself with visible effort. "Better." "Marginally," she said, and she put her hand on his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and the fire was going, and outside the October wind was picking up, and they were entirely warm. Their son was born in April of 1885, in the house on the North Creek Rise, with the midwife from town in attendance and Henry in the next room in a state of sustained alarm that he managed to keep quiet only by occupying his hands constantly with things that did not need doing. The birth was long but not dangerous, And when it was over and Nellie was propped up against the pillows and the baby was placed in her arms, she looked down at him with an expression Henry had never seen on her before, something that was beyond the categories she usually moved in, and she looked up at Henry and said, "Come here." He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the baby so he could see, and the baby was red-faced and bewildered and extremely specific in the way all new people are. And Henry looked at him and then looked at Nellie, and he said nothing for a long time because there was nothing adequate to say. "James," she said. "For my father." "James," he agreed. James Ralston Haskins, whose surname reflected both his parents because Nellie had been clear about that and Henry had been clear that he found nothing objectionable in it, was a substantial baby who grew into an even more substantial boy with Henry's brown eyes and Nellie's jaw and his own particular personality that was distinct from both of them, curious and stubborn and very loud, which was perhaps Nellie's laugh finally having a full expression. The land flourished. The wheat got better every year as Nellie refined her understanding of that particular slope and that particular soil. She expanded her operation carefully, methodically, never faster than the resources allowed, and by 1887 she was selling a reliable surplus at the grain dealer in Dustfall, and her financial records, which she kept with the same precision she brought to everything, showed a clear and growing margin. Henry's cattle operation grew too, more steadily and less dramatically, because that was the nature of cattle as opposed to crops, and by 1887 he was running 110 head on the 40 acres, and the additional 20 he'd purchased in 1886 from a neighbor who was moving to Montana. They combined their operations informally, lending equipment and labor back and forth, but the land remained as they had agreed. Her land was hers and his land was his, and the shared thing was the life they were building on the ground between. James was 3 and beginning to talk in the emphatic and somewhat tyrannical way of 3-year-olds when Nellie told Henry about the second child. She told him in the same way she had told him the first time, matter-of-factly over supper, and his face did the same thing it had done before, and she looked at him affectionately and said, "You're making the face again." "I cannot help the face," he said. "I know," she said. "I have come to accept the face." The second child was a girl, born in the winter of 1888, and they named her Margaret for Nellie's mother, and Margaret was from the beginning the most tranquil child either of them had encountered, which stood in instructive contrast to James, who was by then 4 and operating at a pace that required 2 adults working in coordination. "She has your eyes," Henry said, looking at the baby the evening of her arrival, when the midwife had gone and James was asleep and the house was quiet. Nellie looked down at her daughter. "She has your patience," she said. "She's been in the world 4 hours and she hasn't objected to anything yet." He sat beside her and looked at both of them, his wife and this new daughter, and the house around them was the house Nellie had drawn in the margins of her account book in the winter of 1882, with the south-facing window and the east wall, and outside that east wall the rose bushes had bloomed for 3 springs and would bloom for many more, and the North Creek ran on its own unchanging schedule, and the cottonwoods were tall and bare in the winter dark, and all of it was real. Dustfall grew during those years. Not enormously. It was not on a railroad line, which limited its growth in the way that absence of rail always did in the West. But it added a doctor, which was significant, and a proper hotel to replace the boarding house, and a second saloon which caused Reverend Dawes, when he came through, to deliver a sermon of considerable fire, and a schoolhouse addition that meant the building did not have to serve 2 purposes anymore, and a telegraph line that connected it more firmly to the wider world. The world the telegraph reported on was changing quickly in those years. 1887 and 1888 and 1889, Wyoming was moving toward statehood, which it would achieve in 1890, and the Indian wars that had characterized so much of the preceding decades were drawing to a terrible and unjust close, and the homesteaders were filling the valleys, and the open range that the cattle barons had treated as their own private domain was becoming contested ground. Henry and Nellie were aware of all of this. They were not people who ignored the world. They had both come west at a time when the West was being made, often at enormous cost to the people who had been here before, and they talked about this sometimes in the evenings, the injustice of what was being done to the tribes who had lived on these plains for generations, the way the government's promises were made to be broken, the way progress was a word that meant different things depending on where you stood. Nellie had a particular clarity about this that came from her own experience of what it meant to be told your claims were not valid, your rights were not real, your land was not yours. She did not pretend those experiences were equivalent, but she drew the thread between them, the way power decides whose ownership counts and whose does not. And Henry listened to her and thought about it and agreed with what she said in the way of a man who is encountering ideas he has felt but not articulated. In 1889, Nellie did something that surprised even herself. She went to the territorial legislature's public meeting in Cheyenne, a 2-day journey by stage, on the question of women's suffrage, which Wyoming Territory had granted in 1869, making it the first territory or state to do so, and which the new statehood proceedings had to decide whether to retain. There were voices in the process who wanted to remove it, and Nellie went to speak against that. She went alone, because Henry could not leave the cattle and the children for 2 days, and she would not ask him to. And she went and she stood up in a room full of men, and she spoke about what it meant to own land and work land and contribute to a community, and have no voice in how that community was governed. And she spoke with the clarity and directness and complete absence of apology that characterized everything she did. And she came home on the 3rd day tired and very straight-backed, and Henry met her at the door. "How was it?" he said. "It was important," she said. "I don't know if it made a difference, but I said what needed saying." He took her coat and said, "I know you did. Wyoming retained women's suffrage when it became a state in 1890. Nellie was not solely responsible for that, but she was among the voices that had pushed, and she knew it. And she noted it in her account book that year in the same precise handwriting she used for everything, not as a monument but as a record, the way her father had taught her that a surveyor records what is, so that what was can be known. James started school in the autumn of 1890, which meant he spent his days in the schoolhouse and his evenings filling them in with everything he'd learned, whether or not the adults were interested, and he had an endless appetite for information that was familiar to both his parents. He could read by 5 and was doing his mother's accounts alongside her by 7, which she accepted as a matter of course, and Henry found both admirable and faintly alarming. Margaret at 2 was a different order of creature. She was quiet and observant, and she had early on fixed her complete devotion on her father in a way that James, who had divided his devotion more equitably, did not. She followed Henry around the yard and the barn with the focused attention of a small scientist, and he explained to her in complete seriousness whatever he was doing, fixing the fence or checking the cattle or mending tack, and she listened with enormous gravity and repeated words back to him in her careful small voice. And Nellie watched this from the porch sometimes and felt something in her chest that was so full it almost hurt. One evening in the summer of 1891, Henry came in from the barn and washed at the basin and came to the kitchen where Nellie was finishing the supper, and he stood behind her for a moment and then put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head, and she let the stirring spoon go still and leaned back into him. "Difficult day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. "Just needed to do this." She put one hand over his arms and they stood there in the kitchen while the supper finished on its own schedule, and outside James was calling something to the dog in the yard, and Margaret's voice answered him with instruction, and the summer evening was warm and the creek was running behind the cottonwoods and the wheat was tall on the south slope, and the rose bushes against the east wall had bloomed red and full for the 6th summer. "Henry," she said. "Yes." I am very glad I rode into Dustfall that night." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I am very glad my door latch was sticking," he said. She laughed, and the laugh was warm and full and completely her own, and he held her and thought about the first morning he had come downstairs and found the swept floor and the hot coffee and the particular inhabited quality of an absence, and he thought about how much had grown from that, from the simple act of leaving something open without asking for anything, and how you could never know, when you made a gesture like that, what it would become. In 1892, Nellie's wheat was the best it had been. She had spent 9 years learning that specific slope and that specific soil, and this was the year all of it consolidated into something that was genuinely excellent, a yield that put her operation on sound footing for years to come. She sold at the best price the grain dealer had offered in 3 years, and she came home with the figures written in her book, and she put the book on the table and sat down and looked at it, and then looked at Henry across the table. "The land is paid," she said. He looked at her. "Completely. The mortgage note from the land office, the improvement loan I took in '85, all of it, paid. The land is completely mine." He got up and walked around the table, and he put his hand out and she took it and stood up and he said, "Nellie Ralston." "Nellie Haskins," she corrected him, though she kept both names in different contexts and they both knew it. "Nellie Ralston Haskins," he said. "You built something extraordinary." "We built something extraordinary," she said. "No," he said simply. "You built this. I was here and I am grateful to have been here. But this was yours." She looked at him for a long time. "You know," she said, "every time I think I have taken the full measure of you, you surprise me." He smiled. "Good," he said. "I intend to keep surprising you." She was 34 now, and he was 41, and James was 7, and Margaret was 4. And the house on the North Creek Rise was not the small structure she'd built in 1883 anymore. They had added a room in 1886 and another in 1889, and the south-facing window was still there, and the east wall still had its roses, and there was a proper porch now that Henry had built one winter, and from that porch you could see the south slope and the creek and the line of cottonwoods, and in the distance the red rock ridges that framed the valley. And on summer evenings they sat there together while the children ran in the yard, and the light changed over the ridges in shades that seemed too extravagant to be true. Old Pete Calloway died in 1893 at a great age and with his boots on, which was how he had said he intended to go, and the town was genuinely sorrowed by it, because Pete Calloway had been the kind of person a place is defined by. Nellie and Henry both went to the funeral and stood at the grave in the town cemetery while Reverend Dawes, who was aging but still making his circuits, said the words, and Nellie thought about the first night she'd ridden into Dustfall and Pete coming out of the livery in the dark, and offering her the hayloft and the way she'd looked at him with her storm-gray eyes and refused, and she thought about all the things that had happened since then, everything she had built and become. And she felt a gratitude that was particular and enormous. James at 9 was going through a period of intense interest in astronomy, which his grandmother on his mother's side had loved, and which his grandfather on his mother's side had used professionally, and which had been passed to him through his mother's habit of naming the stars. He had a correspondence going with the science teacher in Cheyenne, obtained through the miracle of the telegraph and the post, and he spent his evenings reading by lamplight, and Nellie encouraged this with the same fierce practicality she applied to everything, because she believed that a person who knew the sky was a person who was less likely to get lost, in the literal and the figurative sense. Margaret at 5 had decided she wanted to work with horses, a decision arrived at so definitively that no one seriously questioned it. She could already do things with horses that some grown men couldn't, and Pete Calloway's son James, who had taken over the livery, said she had the touch. Henry began teaching her in earnest when she was 5, in the careful and serious way he taught everything, and she absorbed it with her characteristic quietness, and began to exceed him by the time she was 7, which he reported to Nellie with an expression of pure paternal delight. The years moved. They moved with the texture of real years, the texture of weather and harvest and illness and health and disagreement and resolution, and the ordinary remarkable recurring fact of two people choosing each other every day in 100 small practical ways. They argued sometimes, not often, but in the particular way of two people who are both clear about their own positions and not easily moved. The arguments were usually about practical matters, and they usually resolved to a solution that was better than either original position, because that was the kind of problem-solving that happened when two minds that respected each other were both fully engaged. The closest they came to a serious conflict was in 1895, when a cattle company from the South made an offer on Nellie's land. A substantial offer, more money than she had seen in one sum, and the man who came with the offer was well-dressed and persuasive, and talked about opportunity and security in the way that men with money talk about those things when they want something from you. Nellie listened to the full offer with complete attention, and then she said, "No." The man blinked. "Mrs. Haskins, I don't think you've considered." "I have considered everything you've said," she said. "The answer is no. This land is not for sale." The man looked at Henry, who was standing at the edge of the room, and Henry looked back at him with an expression of pleasant blankness. "This is your wife's decision," the man said. "This is my wife's land," Henry said. "That has always been and will continue to be entirely her decision." The man left dissatisfied, and Nellie looked at Henry, and Henry looked at Nellie, and she said, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You stood there," she said. "That's not nothing." He thought about that for a while after, about what it meant to stand somewhere. How much of love was exactly that, just being in the right place, present and visible, and not obscuring the person standing beside you. James went away to school in Cheyenne in 1898 at the age of 13, because the school in Dustfall had given him everything it could and he needed more, and his mother and father took him on the stage themselves and settled him with a family they had vetted carefully, and came back alone in the September evening, and the house was notably quieter. "He'll be all right," Henry said. "I know he will," Nellie said. "He's James. He was born all right." Margaret, who was 10, took the absence of her brother as an opportunity to have both parents to herself for the first time in her memory, and she used it with the strategic thoroughness of a 10-year-old who knows exactly what she wants, which was more time in the barn. The new century came, 1900, and Dustfall had a small celebration, and the schoolteacher, a young man from Iowa named David Park, gave a speech about the future, and Henry and Nellie sat in the schoolhouse and listened and held hands in the way they had held hands for 17 years, which was without thinking about it, as naturally as breathing. James came home from school in 1901 at 16, taller than his father, and already corresponding with a university in the East about the possibility of astronomy studies, which Nellie was actively encouraging, and Henry was quietly proud of in the way he was quietly everything. Margaret at 13 had become someone that the whole of Dustfall took seriously in matters of horses, which was not a small thing in a town whose daily life depended on them. She had a way with difficult animals that was not entirely explicable, and several people had come from the next valley specifically to ask her to work with a horse that was giving trouble, and she had done it with the same calm competence she brought to everything. Henry looked at his daughter one evening as she came in from the barn and thought about Nellie the first day he'd seen her at the store, reorganizing the bulk goods with the calm authority of someone who knows what she thinks and does not require your agreement. He thought about how remarkable it was, the way people pass things on, not just in blood but in example, in the daily showing of what a person can be. In 1903, when James was 18, he received a letter that he brought to his parents at the supper table with the very careful lack of expression of a person who is trying not to show how much something means to them. He had been offered a place at Oberlin College in Ohio, in the sciences, and there was a small scholarship because of his correspondence work with the Cheyenne teacher, who had written a letter on his behalf. Nellie read the letter twice. Henry read it once. They looked at each other across the table, and James watched them with enormous and barely contained tension. "Ohio," Nellie said. "Your grandfather was from Ohio." "Henry's father," James said. "Yes." Nellie looked at her son, who was 18 and tall and had her gray eyes and his father's quiet and something entirely his own, which was this specific form of reaching, this need to know the sky as well as the ground. And she thought about her own father who had taught her the stars on summer nights on the porch in Pennsylvania. And she thought about what James Ralston would have thought of his grandson going to study the sky formally. And she felt a completeness that was almost too large to hold. "You'll go," she said. James released the tension he'd been holding. "You're sure?" "I am absolutely sure," she said. "You will go, and you will study everything they can teach you, and you will write to us every week, and you will come home for the summers until you can't." Henry reached across the table and put his hand on James's arm and said, "Your grandfather would have been very proud." James left for Ohio in September of 1903, and Nellie stood on the road and watched the stage go until it was gone over the Red Rock Ridge, and Henry stood beside her, and they were both quiet for a while. "He'll be all right," she said, echoing what he'd said 5 years ago about the Cheyenne school. "He will," Henry agreed. "He's James," she said. "He was always going to leave for the sky." Henry put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on the road in the September morning and let the loss of him be what it was, which was also a kind of pride too large to be dignified. Margaret at 15 had taken on more of the ranch work in a formal way, and she and Henry worked the cattle together with the efficiency of two people who understood each other without many words, and the land ran better than it ever had. Nellie's wheat was now a known quantity at the grain dealers in 2 counties, and she had arranged a supply agreement with a mill in Cheyenne that gave her a predictable price, which was a thing she had worked toward for years, and which represented a security she had not allowed herself to count on until it was real. In 1905, Margaret fell in love, which surprised no one as much as Margaret herself. He was a young man from the next valley named Eli Brooks, who had come to Dustfall with a string of horses he was selling, and he and Margaret had a conversation about a particular mare that went on for 4 hours and ended with him looking at her, as though he'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Henry and Nellie watched this with the combination of amusement and very attentiveness that parents bring to watching their children encounter love for the first time. Eli Brooks was 20, a solid and careful young man with a father who ran a fair operation, and he was clearly out of his depth with Margaret in a way he found entirely agreeable. He asked Henry's permission first, in the old-fashioned way, and Henry told him gently that he ought to ask Margaret, that she was the one whose permission mattered, and Eli looked at him with the slight bewilderment of a man whose father had done things differently, and then nodded and went to ask Margaret. Margaret said yes, after a conversation that Nellie later heard described as approximately 45 minutes of extremely direct questions about his intentions, his character, and his views on the management of horses, all of which Eli answered to her satisfaction. "She's thorough," Nellie said to Henry that evening. "I can't imagine where she gets that," he said. Nellie looked at him sidelong. "Your side of the family," she said, and he laughed, and it was the particular laugh of a man who has been in love for over 20 years and finds everything about that love still entirely interesting. James came home from Ohio in the summer of 1906 with a degree and a manner of discussing stars that was now formally educated and entirely familiar. And he was the same James with more. And he sat on the porch with his parents in the summer evenings, and they talked the way they had always talked in this family, about land and sky and what could be done. And Nellie listened to her son and thought about her father and felt the long thread of it. How one person's love of knowing the sky becomes another person's life. He did not stay in Dustfall. He went eventually to work with a survey company in Denver, which used the new astronomical tools to do the work his grandfather had done by older means, and he came home when he could, which was several times a year. And when he came home, he ate his mother's cooking and sat in his father's chair by the fire and was entirely home, even if home was no longer where he lived. Margaret and Eli married in 1907 and settled in the next valley, and the horse operation they built together became, over the following years, one of the better regarded breeding operations in that part of Wyoming. They had 3 children in 4 years, 2 boys and then a girl, and Nellie and Henry were grandparents before they had quite gotten used to the word, and it turned out to fit. Henry at 56 was still the same man he had been at 31, quieter perhaps, more certain in the way of someone who has made peace with who he is, and he moved through his days with the same unhurried attention to whatever the day required. And Nellie at 49 was still Nellie, still the most organized intelligence in any room she occupied, still precise and still fierce and still, underneath all of that, capable of the same complete and unguarded openness she'd shown him for the first time on the porch of the schoolhouse in the starlight of a December night in 1882. They sat together on their porch in the long evenings of the Wyoming summers, with the creek running and the cottonwoods grown very tall now, the same trees that had been there when she'd first ridden under them with her numb hands and her thin blanket and her enormous pride. And they talked and were quiet in the way of people who have run out of things to hide from each other and find that restful. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said one evening, "if the latch had been fixed?" He considered this. "Often," he said. "I try not to think about it too long." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so cold," she said. "I didn't let myself think about how cold I was until I saw the light." "I know," he said. "I sat on the mare at your gate for a long time," she said, "working myself up to it." "I know that too," he said. "I heard you come and I lay still and didn't move." She turned and looked at him. "You heard me." "I heard the gate," he said, "and then nothing for a while and then the barn door." She was quiet. "You didn't come down." "No," he said. "You didn't need me to come down. You needed the door to be open." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she looked back out at the valley, at the long gold light of the evening coming down through the cottonwoods and falling on the south slope where the wheat was not growing anymore because the agreement with the Cheyenne mill meant she was growing less and managing what she grew more carefully, and the slope had gone back to grass which was beautiful in its own way, pale gold and moving. "I have thought many times about that night," she said. "What it was, what you were saying with it." "What was I saying?" he said. She considered it carefully the way she considered everything. "That you saw me," she said, "not what I was. Not a problem or a charity case or a woman who needed fixing, just me, and that there was room for me as I was." She looked at him. "That is not a small thing to say." "No," he said, "it's not." He reached across and took her hand, and she held it in the way she held everything, firmly and without performance, and the evening light moved over the valley and the cottonwoods made their particular sound, the dry bright rustle of summer leaves, and down in the barn Margaret's old horse, an ancient roan who had carried Nellie all the way from her cold beginning to this warm end, moved in her stall in the companionable way of an animal that knows it is safe. The mare had made the full journey with her. That horse, who had been young and tired the night she rode into Dustfall with 11 cents and a broken saddle strap and a pride like a stone wall, had grown old in good pasture and warm winters, and was treated with the respect due to an animal that had carried someone through the hardest part of a life. Nellie had never bought another riding horse, because she didn't need to, and because the roan was the roan, and some loyalties are not practical but they are real. The roan would die in the following spring, peacefully, in the pasture with the sun on her, and Nellie would be there when she did, and she would stand beside her for a while, and think about all the miles between there and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then she would go inside and make coffee and sit at her table with her ledger and her account books and her view of the south slope and the cottonwoods, and she would be all right, because all right was something she had built for herself, brick by brick and season by season. And it held. But that was in the spring, and this was the summer evening, and Henry was beside her, and the valley was warm and the creek ran on. James wrote from Denver every week. Margaret's youngest had started walking. Eli's horses had won at the county show. Reverend Dawes, impossibly old, had sent a letter saying he planned to come through Dustfall one more time in the autumn. "I want to have the whole family here when he does," Nellie said. "James and Margaret and Eli and all the children." "We can do that," Henry said. "A proper dinner," she said. "At the long table." "We'll need a longer table," he said. "Then you'll build one," she said, in the simple way she said things that were completely decided. He smiled. "I'll build one," he agreed, and he would. He would spend the last weeks of that summer building a table long enough to fit all of them, James and Margaret and Eli, and the 3 grandchildren and Reverend Dawes when he came. Long enough for the family that had grown from a cold night and an open door, and 2 people who understood each other before they knew each other. And the table would be solid and well-made in the way Henry made things. And it would last for many years, long enough to have grandchildren's grandchildren sitting at it. Long enough to outlast the people who had built it, and to carry forward in its grain and its weight the particular love that had built it, which was the love of 2 people who had each refused to be diminished and had found each other because of it. The valley held the light a long time on those summer evenings. The red rock ridges went from gold to pink to the deep rose of last light, and then the sky went the deep Wyoming blue that was like nothing else anywhere. And the first stars came out, and Nellie named them in the quiet as she had always done, as her father had taught her, as she had taught James. And Henry sat beside her and listened to her name them. And the names were bright and old and true, and the night was warm, and the door was open.